My name is Monique Bennett. I am 61 years old, and for 33 years, I believed that a good woman kept her house warm, her opinions quiet, and her gratitude visible at all times. I believed that with my whole heart, right up until the Tuesday night in September when my husband sat across from me at our kitchen table in Buckhead, Atlanta, the same walnut table where I had rolled out pie dough for 3 decades, where our son Isaiah had done his 4th grade homework while I stirred pots on the stove behind him, where I had addressed Christmas cards and hummed old hymns while Georgia heat pressed slow and heavy against the windows outside. And he told me, in a voice as measured and final as a period at the end of a sentence he had been composing for years, that our home had been sold. He did not ask. He did not apologize. He did not even look away. Monique. His voice was low, precise, the voice of a man who had been rehearsing this moment and was satisfied with how it was landing. The house has been sold. You have 30 days to make other arrangements. You don't contribute financially, so you don't have standing to contest it. That's just the reality. Before we go any further into this story, if something in those words just made your chest tighten, if you have heard a version of that sentence in your own kitchen, at your own table, I need you to stay with me, because what I found in my husband's vest pocket that same night is what changed the entire direction of everything that followed. And what I did with what I found will take every minute of this story to tell you properly. Now let me take you back to that kitchen. The evening had started the way most evenings did in the Bennett household on that quiet street in Buckhead. I had made pot roast. It had been in the slow cooker since 10 that morning, and by 5 o'clock the whole downstairs smelled the way that smell is supposed to smell. Warm and heavy, and like someone loves you enough to start dinner before lunch is over. Isaiah and Tiana had driven up from their place in Decatur. I remember the sound of their car in the driveway, the way the front door always stuck a little in the humidity and had to be pushed with the shoulder. I remember setting out the good placemats, the ones I kept in the second drawer, the ones with the embroidered edges that my mother had given me as a wedding gift 33 years ago. I remember thinking, as I filled the water glasses, that it was a nice evening for a family dinner. Andre came downstairs at 6:15 in a charcoal gray vest, freshly pressed, always freshly pressed, and poured himself a glass of water without looking at me. He sat at the head of the table. He placed his glass down on the placemat with the careful deliberateness of a man who has already decided what the evening is going to be. Isaiah sat to my left. Tiana sat across from me. The pot roast was in the center of the table, and the kitchen light was doing that warm amber thing it did in the evenings, the kind of light that should make a room feel like safety. Andre set his glass down and spoke. Monique, the house has been sold. You have exactly 30 days to make other arrangements. You don't contribute financially to this household, so you don't have standing to contest the sale. That's just the reality of the situation. The refrigerator hummed. The ice maker dropped a fresh batch into the tray somewhere behind me. Somewhere outside, a car rolled slowly past. I remember the exact temperature of that silence. I have spent 33 years becoming an expert in the temperature of silences. Isaiah stared at the grain of the wood tabletop like it might open up and offer him a way out. Tiana sat very still with both hands in her lap, and I could see from where I sat that she had her phone gripped between her palms so hard her knuckles had gone pale. What surprised me more than anything, was that I did not cry. I had cried over so many smaller things across so many years, a cold shoulder at dinner, a dismissive wave when I tried to speak, an eye roll so practiced it had become a kind of punctuation. I had cried over all of those things, quietly, in the bathroom, with the water running so no one could hear. But sitting at that table on that Tuesday night in September, with the pot roast going cold and my mother's embroidered placemats under the good water glasses, something in me went absolutely still. Not the still of defeat. Not the still of a woman who has given up. The still of a woman who has, after 33 years, finally understood exactly what she is dealing with. There is something important to understand about this moment, not just about Monique, but about a pattern that plays out in thousands of homes in ways that are rarely visible from the outside. Psychologists who study long-term coercive control in marriages describe a particular phenomenon. The moment a controlled person stops reacting with fear and begins reacting with clarity is not typically a dramatic awakening. It does not arrive on a heroic morning with sunlight streaming through the window. It arrives, most often, as a quiet internal shift, almost mechanical in its stillness, in the middle of an ordinary moment that simply went one step too far. For Monique, that step was the word standing. Not the cruelty of the sentence. She had lived with cruelty for decades. It was the legal framing, the language of property and entitlement applied to a woman sitting at her own kitchen table. Something in her nervous system, exhausted as it was from 33 years of managed fear, recognized that language not as a wound, but as a signal. The threat had finally been named out loud. And named threats, unlike the ambient ones we cannot quite articulate, can be addressed. This is why survivors of long-term emotional abuse often describe their turning point not as the worst moment, but as a specific, almost mundane moment that simply crystallized something they had already known for years. The knowledge was always there. It was waiting for the right sentence to give it permission to surface. I looked at my husband across the walnut table and I asked him, very quietly, "How long have you been planning this, Andre?" He smiled. It was a particular smile, the smile of a man who has never once genuinely entertained the possibility that he might be wrong about something. "A long time," he said. "What exactly did you think your options were, Monique?" I stood up from my chair. I did not raise my voice. I did not plead or bargain or reach across the table for his arm the way I might have done 100 times before. I looked at the man I had married at Ebenezer Baptist Church in the spring of 1991, and I said, "I don't know how many rights I have left in this house, but I know one thing for certain. Tonight is the last night you will ever speak my life into existence for me." Isaiah's chair scraped hard against the floor. Tiana looked up from her lap. Andre's smile flickered. Just for a fraction of a second. Just enough. I walked out of the kitchen. I walked down the hall toward the bedroom we had shared for 33 years. And as I passed the master bedroom door, I stopped. Andre had gone into the bathroom. I could hear the water running. I don't entirely know what made me do what I did next. Call it instinct, call it 33 years of watching and learning the geography of a man's habits. I reached into the breast pocket of the charcoal vest he had draped over the bedroom chair. Inside, I found 3 things. First, a single earring. Red, dangling costume jewelry, the kind that swings when you move. It was not mine. I had never owned anything remotely like it. Second, a small brass key, the kind that opens a post office box. No label, no markings, no explanation. Third, a document. Legal-sized paper that smelled faintly of a copy machine and a law office. I unfolded it in the dark of our bedroom with the bathroom water still running 10 feet away, and I read the heading printed at the top. Petition for review of civil capacity and financial guardianship. The name on the petition was mine, Monique Ruth Bennett. My full name in a legal document I had never seen, had never been informed about, had never consented to. My name on a petition to have a court determine whether I was capable of making my own financial and personal decisions. My hands were shaking so hard the paper made a sound in the dark. Not rustling, trembling, like the document itself could feel what it contained. I stood in the bedroom I had shared with this man for 33 years, and I understood something that moved through my body like cold water. This was not a man preparing to leave a marriage. This was a man who had been building a cage, one quiet document at a time, for years. I pressed the paper flat against my chest. I stood in the dark. I whispered to the empty room, to whatever was listening, to my mother, God rest her, wherever she was. They're not just trying to take the house. They're trying to take my right to exist as a free person. Outside, the first rain of the evening had started against the windows. The old oak in the backyard was losing leaves early that year, pressing them flat against the glass, one by one in the wind, like small dark hands reaching in. The kitchen light still burned behind me down the hall. The refrigerator still hummed. The ice maker still worked. Everything in that house was still doing exactly what it had always done. And I was standing in the dark, with evidence in my hands that my husband had been planning my legal incapacitation. Drop a comment right now. If you were standing in that dark bedroom, holding that paper, would you confront him that same night? Or would you stay quiet and build your case in secret? There is no wrong answer, but your instinct will tell you something real about yourself. The next morning, I put on my good navy blouse, the one with the small pearl buttons that my mother always said made me look like a woman who meant business. I hadn't worn it in 2 years. I buttoned every button in front of the mirror and looked at my own face with the kind of attention I rarely gave myself anymore. 61 years old, short, softly curled hair, eyes steadier than I expected. I drove to Simone Powell's office on Peachtree Street northeast at 8 o'clock. I'd called her the night before from the driveway, voice low, the guardianship petition folded inside my coat. A woman at Ebenezer Baptist had pressed her name into my hand 2 years ago over a potluck table like she was handing me something dangerous. If you ever need her. Then she looked away. Simone Powell was 58, sharp-eyed and unhurried, with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead like a crown. Her office smelled like good coffee and old files. Behind her desk, a framed needlepoint that said, "The truth has a very long memory." I laid everything out, the petition, the brass key, the red earring, the 30-day notice, Isaiah's face, all of it in order. Simone read the guardianship petition twice. Then she set it down, folded her hands, and said, "This is not a divorce proceeding. This is a containment system, and whoever built it has been working on it for a long time." She opened a second folder, property records she had already pulled before I arrived. $450,000, transferred over 4 years from the account attached to my mother's rental duplex on Cascade Road in southwest Atlanta. My mother, Ruthie Lane Carter, had paid that property off over 30 years of careful saving. She believed in bricks and mortar the way some people believe in scripture. "Andre persuaded you to sign a restructuring document about 5 years ago," Simone said. "He called it a tax reorganization." I remembered. East Paces Ferry Road, white tablecloths. "This is just accounting, Mo. You trust me, don't you?" And I had signed because I always signed. Because not signing meant 3 days of silence and a husband who looked through me like glass until I apologized for something I hadn't done. "The property sold 18 months later," Simone said. "The proceeds went into an account that appears on no joint financial disclosure." Then she turned to the deed reassignment. At the bottom, in my mother's signature line, was something that looked like her handwriting. "The date on this signature," Simone said, tapping it once, "is the week your mother was too weak to hold her own water cup." I remembered holding that cup for her, helping her drink through a straw. "She could not have signed this," I said. My voice came out thin. "I don't believe she did," Simone said. "I believe this was forged. Your mother tried to leave you a way out. Andre took it." There is something important to understand about this moment. Not just about Monique, but about a pattern that plays out in thousands of homes in ways that are rarely visible from the outside. Psychologists who study long-term coercive control describe a particular phenomenon. The most effective control in long-term relationships operates not through force, but through the slow erosion of a person's confidence in their own perception. Over months and years, the controlled person is gently, persistently taught that their instincts are unreliable, that the person controlling them is the one with the clear head and reliable judgment. By the time Andre slid that folder across a white tablecloth and said, "You trust me, don't you?" Monique had already spent decades learning that trusting herself was dangerous, and trusting Andre was safe. The signature was not the failure of her intelligence, It was the predictable outcome of a system designed from the very beginning to produce exactly that result. The room was very still. I sat in that chair and felt something in my chest shift. Not break, but shift. Like a bone set wrong for years, finally moving toward alignment. "There is more," Simone said. She opened the insurance file. Andre had increased the life insurance policy in my name, himself as sole beneficiary, 5 years prior. Simultaneously, he had engaged a separate attorney and begun assembling documentation, financial records with every asset in his name alone, psychological assessments from a provider I had never met, statements gathered from neighbors who had no idea what they were contributing to. "He was not preparing to divorce you," Simone said. "He was preparing to have you legally declared incapable of managing your own affairs." I whispered, "He wasn't preparing to leave me. He was preparing to make me someone who wasn't allowed to decide her own life." That night, Andre was on his phone in the bathroom, with the door not quite closed. His voice was low and satisfied, the voice he used when the performance of reasonableness wasn't required. "She's weak. I've been managing her for 30 years. You give her 3 days of silence and she'll apologize for things she didn't even do. I built that. It's a system." A system. That word. I lay in the dark and thought, 33 years. I thought it was a marriage. He thought it was a management structure. The next morning, I called Jasmine Brooks. She'd run a coffee shop on Edgewood Avenue in Old Fourth Ward for years. Mismatched chairs, old photographs of Atlanta on the walls, the best sweet potato muffins in Fulton County. We'd grown distant. I told myself it was just life. She answered on the second ring. When I told her what I'd found, her silence told me everything before she said a word. "Jasmine, how long have you known about the other woman?" "Mo." "How long?" 2 years, maybe more. I saw them on Marietta Street. I told myself it wasn't my place. I told myself you seemed fine. I seemed fine, I said, because I had been very well trained to seem fine. The woman was Vanessa Cole, 29 years old, younger sister of a woman who sat 3 rows behind me at Ebenezer Baptist every Sunday. A woman who had sat in my kitchen 2 Easters ago eating my mother's peach cobbler, the recipe on a worn index card stained with a coffee ring I'd never quite washed out, and had looked at me and said, "Miss Monique, I hope I have a home like this someday." The boutique she had opened 6 months ago on Ponce de Leon Avenue had been funded, in significant part, by money from my mother's property. I decided to start selling my baking. I had made traditional Southern pastries my entire adult life. Layer cakes, peach cobblers, sweet potato pies, tea cakes. Made them for every church fundraiser, every neighbor with a new baby or a hard week. Never once thought of them in terms of dollar value, because no one had ever suggested that what I made in my kitchen was worth money. But Simone had said something in our second meeting I've kept written on an index card ever since. "Monique, 33 years of unpaid domestic labor carries quantifiable economic value in a marital asset dispute. You were not a dependent in this marriage. You were an uncompensated business partner. And the law is beginning to understand that." I went to Sweet Auburn Curb Market on Auburn Avenue on a Saturday morning in October. Folding table, 2 tubs of baked goods, a handwritten sign. Hands shaking, not from fear, but from the specific vulnerability of showing up as yourself after decades of making yourself invisible. 40 minutes in, Andre appeared. He took hold of my arm, not hard enough to bruise, but in that proprietary way I knew so well, the grip that said, "You belong to me, and I can move you," and said, loud enough for everyone nearby, "You see this? I told you you'd end up out here begging. Look at yourself." I looked at the hand on my arm. I looked at the people who had gone quiet around us. "Let go of my arm, Andre." He let go, believing, the way controllers always believe, that the damage was done. He was wrong. Someone had been recording from the moment he walked up. The video, his hand on my arm, his raised voice, my stillness, my 2 words, and the quiet dignity with which I turned back to my table, circulated through Atlanta's Black women's networks within 48 hours. Thousands of shares. Women who knew that grip. Women who recognized that tone. Andre saw the video, and instead of shame, he did what controllers do when their grip slips. He called it evidence. Told his attorney, his colleagues, his church circle, that the video confirmed everything he'd been documenting. His wife was emotionally unstable, making public scenes, exactly consistent with the psychological assessments on file. Meanwhile, without telling a single person, Tiana had been going through transaction records with the careful eyes of a woman who works in banking and has started asking questions she should have asked long ago. She found wire transfers from an account connected to the P.O. box key I'd found in Andre's vest, leading through 2 intermediate accounts to the startup costs of a boutique on Ponce de Leon Avenue. Tiana began printing documents, sending them anonymously in plain manila envelopes with no return address to Simone Powell's office on Peachtree Street. I didn't know any of this yet. I was sitting alone in a parking lot, looking at a copy of my own credit report, which contained a psychological assessment I had never consented to, describing me as emotionally volatile and financially dependent, and finding attached to it a supporting note bearing my son's signature. Isaiah had not known what he signed. Andre had told him it was a routine insurance update. Isaiah had signed without reading because his father asked him to, and because the thought that his father would use his signature against his mother had no place in the world as Isaiah understood it then. I sat in that parking lot and looked at my son's handwriting, and I cried. Not quietly, not with the water running so nobody could hear. I cried out loud, alone, and it was terrible and necessary. I didn't know I was already less alone than I thought. I thought the parking lot with my son's signature in my lap was the lowest point. I had no idea Andre was already planning to take that video from the market and use it as the final piece of a legal case to strip me of every remaining right I had. Stay close, because what happened 6 months later in a ballroom full of Atlanta's most powerful families will show you what happens when a system of control finally meets the one thing it was never designed to survive: the truth, documented, witnessed, and spoken out loud. 6 months after Sweet Auburn Market, I opened Second Rise Bakery on Auburn Avenue. The space was a former dry goods storefront, original brick walls, high ceilings, tall windows that caught the morning light and held it warm against the wood floors. Jasmine helped me paint the window trim on a Saturday. Zora Mitchell, a businesswoman who had seen the viral market video through a mutual contact in Simone's network, had reached out, come in, tasted what I made, reviewed my numbers, and said without preamble, "I've been where you are. I don't invest in products. I invest in people who are done being afraid to take up space." We opened on a Thursday morning. The line was out the door before 8 o'clock. That same Thursday evening, across town at the Grand Hyatt on Peachtree Road in Buckhead, Andre Bennett held a gala. He called it the Bennett Family Legacy Fund, a philanthropic initiative unveiled to Atlanta's business and civic community with printed programs and centerpieces and a string quartet stationed near the entrance to the ballroom. Andre stood at the center of it in a new suit, receiving handshakes, collecting the warm public regard that is very easy to accumulate when you have controlled the narrative for decades. 3 days before the gala, he had called me. "You need to be there," the organizational voice, the one he used when he was arranging people into positions. "Your absence will be interpreted as instability. People will ask why you're not supporting your own family's legacy." "Let them ask," I said. The warmth left his voice like a switch being thrown. "Monique, I have the psychological documentation. I have the market video. I have supporting signatures on file. If you make this public and difficult, I will use everything I have, and I will ensure that what you are trying to build on Auburn Avenue does not survive the month. Come to the gala, smile, say what you are supposed to say, or deal with what comes next." I let that sit in the air for a moment. "No," I said, and I ended the call. Let us stop here for a moment. Because what Andre did in that phone call is worth examining carefully, not just as a plot point, but as a psychological pattern that is more common than most people realize. What he was doing has a specific name in behavioral psychology. It is called instrumental control through reputational threat. The message was not, "Come or I'll hurt you." The message was far more sophisticated than that. The message was, "The world will see you as unstable if you don't perform compliance. And if you are seen as unstable, I will use that perception as a legal weapon." This is the final, most refined stage of a coercive control system. It does not need physical force. It does not even need the controlled person to believe the threat is legitimate. It only needs to create enough uncertainty, enough fear of the consequences of noncompliance to keep the person in their designated role for one more day. Andre had been running this system for 33 years, and it had worked reliably every single time, because it was calibrated specifically to Monique, to her specific fears, her specific vulnerabilities, her specific love for the people around her. Every controlled person has a unique pressure map, and the person who has lived closest to them for 30 years knows every single point on it. What Andre did not account for, what controllers almost never account for, is the moment when the controlled person's fear of staying becomes greater than their fear of leaving. That tipping point is different for every person. For Monique, it came not in the form of courage, which is often how we mythologize these stories. It came in the form of a single, quiet word. No. Not shouted, not performed, just spoken into a phone on an autumn evening, followed by the soft click of a call being ended. That no was 33 years in the making. 2 days before the gala, Isaiah came by the bakery. He said he wanted to help with some camera equipment before the opening. The monitor above the register had been giving trouble. He was there for an hour when he found something on a backup drive he had connected to troubleshoot a network issue. The drive had been left on the counter after a delivery. It was Andre's. Isaiah came to the kitchen doorway with his face doing something I had not seen it do since he was a small boy. That transparent, undisguised look of a child who has just understood that an adult he trusted lied to him in a way that cannot be undone. "Mom," he said, "can you come here?" On the backup drive, there was a folder containing email correspondence between Andre and his attorney, a strategy document, a timeline, evidence lists, planned legal submissions, the market video from Sweet Auburn, psychological assessments, and Isaiah's own signature, the one he provided on what he believed was a routine insurance form, listed in the strategy document as witness corroboration of subject's diminished decision-making capacity, obtained without subject's knowledge, non-retractable. Isaiah stared at his own name in that document. "Mom," he said, "I thought that was just insurance paperwork. He sat me down at the kitchen table. He said it was for the family health plan update. I signed it without—" He stopped. His hands were flat on the counter. "He used me." I looked at my son, 32 years old, tall, carrying the particular exhaustion of a man who has been telling himself a version of events that finally no longer holds together. "You didn't destroy me, Isaiah," I said. But your silence gave him more time to try. He absorbed that. He did not deflect or explain it away. He stood there and let it land. "I knew about Vanessa," he said very quietly. "I found out 14 months ago. I told myself if I said something, it would destroy the family, and you'd be left with nothing, and—" "Isaiah." My voice was quiet, but it was not soft in the way it used to be soft. The managed softness of a woman keeping peace in a house where peace was a performance. Every month you stayed quiet was another month the system worked exactly the way he built it to work. You need to understand that. He nodded. He pressed the back of his hand against his mouth for a moment. "What are you going to do?" I asked him. "With what you know right now." He looked at me. "Whatever you need me to do, Mom." "I don't need you to do it for me," I said. "I need you to do it because you understand that it's right." He stood up straight. Isaiah's arc in this story is one that deserves its own moment of reflection, because it represents something that is rarely given space in these narratives, the psychology of the person who is not the villain and not the hero, but the bystander. Isaiah Bennett is not a bad man. That is, in some ways, what makes his position so important to understand. He loved his mother. He was troubled by what he saw. He felt genuine discomfort with his father's behavior. And yet for 14 months, he stayed quiet. Researchers who study family systems describe a concept called loyalty binds, the psychological pressure placed on children, even adult children, when they are positioned between two parents in conflict. The child experiences an unconscious terror that choosing one parent's truth means losing the other parent entirely. And so they choose what feels, in the moment, like the least destructive option: silence, neutrality, staying out of it. What Isaiah had not yet understood, what he was only beginning to understand as he stood in that bakery kitchen, is that in situations of active harm, neutrality is not a neutral act. When one person has power and one person is being systematically harmed, standing in the middle does not preserve balance. It tips the scales. Andre had also, deliberately and consciously, cultivated this loyalty bind in his son. He had framed every disclosure, every request for silence, every piece of paperwork in the language of family loyalty. We don't air our business outside the family. Your mother gets overwhelmed. This protects her. You sign this, it helps all of us. He had made Isaiah feel that silence was love. The moment Isaiah read the strategy document with his own signature listed as a weapon against his mother was the moment that framing finally, irrevocably broke. Not because he became a different person, but because he had, at last, seen clearly what his silence had actually been holding in place. That Thursday evening, the Grand Hyatt Ballroom on Peachtree Road was full. Business leaders, church elders, Atlanta families with long memories and long histories. Several hundred people arranged around tables with white linens and small candles, the string quartet playing softly near the entrance, the printed programs on every chair. Andre sat at the head table, looking exactly like a man who owns every room he enters. He had been building that posture for 64 years, and it sat on him naturally, the way very long habits do. Tiana was at the podium. She had been preparing her tribute speech for weeks. She was polished and composed in a deep green dress, the printed remarks in her hand, the microphone adjusted. She looked out at the room. Then she looked down at the paper in her hands. She folded it in half, set it on the podium, reached into the small evening bag at her side. I was given a speech to deliver tonight, she said in a clear, unhurried voice. I have decided not to deliver it. The room recalibrated its attention with the collective, subtle shift of hundreds of people who have just realized they are not at the event they came to. Instead, Tiana said, I want to share something. She pressed play. Andre's voice came through the Grand Hyatt's ballroom sound system with the clean, unmistakable clarity of a man speaking without performance, without management, without the decades-long, careful curating of his public image. The kid's signature is already on file. I built her up to be dependent. She's been trained for 30 years. You give her silence for 3 days, and she apologizes for things she didn't even do. Once the guardianship review is filed, she has no standing for anything. I made sure of that. The ballroom went silent, the way a room goes silent when something irreversible has just occurred. Not the waiting quiet of an audience, but the stunned, airless silence of people who are in the process of revising everything they thought they knew about the last several years. Andre was on his feet before the recording ended. He moved through the tables toward the stage with the focused, controlled urgency of a man whose entire architecture is collapsing, and who genuinely believes that if he can reach the source, he can stop it. Simone Powell stood up from her table. Navy dress, leather folder open in front of her, 4 tables from the front. I represent Monique Bennett, she said, at a volume the room could hear without a microphone. And I have documentation I would like to enter into the public record. She presented it all. The financial transfers, $450,000, traced step by step. The forged signature on my mother's deed, along with a handwriting analysis from a certified document examiner. The insurance policy, the fabricated psychological assessments from a provider with no documented contact with me, the guardianship petition, the email strategy folder from the backup drive, and the wire transfers, Tiana's months of careful, anonymous work, connecting the P.O. Box account to a boutique clothing shop on Ponce de Leon Avenue. A murmur moved through the back of the room. Several people turned, a few pointed. Vanessa Cole was in the ballroom. She had been seated near the back among the invited guests, in a red dress, in what I could only conclude was an arrangement of extraordinary confidence on Andre's part, or extraordinary carelessness, which in the end amounts to the same thing. At her ears, catching the light of the ballroom chandelier, swinging slightly as she turned at the sound of her name moving through the room in whispers, were a pair of red earrings. Dangling, costume jewelry, long and unmistakable. The exact earrings I had found in my husband's vest pocket 9 months ago, in the dark of our bedroom, on the night everything began. Vanessa Cole lowered her head, gathered her bag from the back of her chair, and walked toward the exit doors. The entire room watched her go. The silence that followed her out was more eloquent than anything anyone said for the next several minutes. Isaiah walked to the stage. He took the microphone from the stand. He turned to face the room, several hundred people, many of whom had known his father for decades, many of whom had shaken his hand at this very type of event, many of whom had, in various ways and with various levels of awareness, been part of the world that permitted what I had lived through. "I'm not going to ask my mother for forgiveness tonight," he said. His voice was steady in the way that voices are steady when a person has made a decision and is no longer uncertain about it. That is between her and me, and it doesn't belong in a ballroom. But I am going to say this, out loud, in front of everyone my father has ever invited to witness his version of our family. He paused. I knew about the affair for 14 months. I stayed quiet because I told myself I was protecting the family. I signed a document my father told me was insurance paperwork without asking what it was actually for. I watched my mother get smaller every year, and I called it staying out of it. He looked out at the room. I was not staying out of it. I was choosing the easier side, and I'm saying that publicly tonight, in this room, because the silence is what made it possible, and I am done being part of the silence. The ballroom was still. And then, from somewhere near the middle of the room, an older woman, silver-haired, in a burgundy dress, with the particular composure of someone who has lived long enough to know a genuine moment of public truth when she sees one, stood up and began to clap. The applause moved outward from her like a wave finding a shore, table by table, until the room was full of it. I stood and watched my son in the light of that room and thought of the little boy who had done his homework at my walnut kitchen table while I stirred pots behind him, and I thought, he found his way. It took time, but he found his way. Andre passed me on his way to the exit. He leaned down close to my ear, his voice compressed to the tight, stripped whisper of a man who has just watched every structure he spent years building be dismantled in a hotel ballroom in front of his entire world. "You think this is over?" he said. "That foundation of yours will not survive the week." I looked at him, at the man in the pressed suit with the careful posture who had spent 33 years building a system designed to ensure I would never believe I was capable of being anything other than what he needed me to be. "Andre," I said, "you spent 33 years making sure I didn't know my own strength, and it still took everything you had." I held his eyes. I think we both know how that story ends. He left. I stood in the Grand Hyatt Ballroom on Peachtree Road in Atlanta, Georgia, surrounded by the documented evidence of everything that had been done to me, and I breathed in slowly. And I thought, I am not afraid of him anymore. That thought, plain, quiet, complete, was the most beautiful thing I had felt in 33 years. What happened 3 days later nearly cost me everything I had built. And what I found inside my mother's old recipe tin changed the entire reason I was still fighting. 3 days after the gala, the temporary operating account for Second Rise Foundation was frozen. A regulatory review initiated by an anonymous complaint regarding the origin of startup funds. Simone called me at 7 in the morning. She said the complaint had been filed within 48 hours of the gala. The filing was precise, technically competent, and timed with the deliberateness of someone who had been waiting for the right moment. "He doesn't need to win," Simone said when I came to her office. "He needs to make you run out of energy. He needs the delays and the legal fees and the uncertainty to accumulate until you decide that it isn't worth it anymore." That has always been the strategy. Containment does not require victory. It only requires exhaustion. Simone's words deserve a moment of stillness because they describe something that is one of the least understood dynamics in coercive control situations: the difference between winning and wearing down. Most people, when they think of an abuser losing power, imagine a dramatic defeat, a confrontation, a confession, a moment of visible collapse. But experienced lawyers and therapists who work in this field will tell you that the most sophisticated controllers are rarely trying to win. They are trying to outlast. The logic is coldly rational. If you can make the process of fighting back expensive enough, exhausting enough, and uncertain enough, a significant proportion of people will eventually decide that the personal cost is simply too high. This is why financial control is so often the companion of emotional control in these relationships. A person with no money, no credit history, no assets in their name, and no professional identity of their own is not merely vulnerable. They are structurally prevented from sustaining a prolonged legal fight. They will run out of resources before their opponent does. Andre had spent 5 years building exactly this structural advantage. He had not just taken Monique's inheritance, he had taken her runway, her ability to keep going. What he had not anticipated, what this particular calculation failed to account for, was that Monique had something he did not: a network of women who understood the game because they had lived inside versions of it themselves. Simone, who had spent 30 years documenting exactly this pattern. Zora, who had rebuilt her own life after her own version of the same story. Tiana, who had been quietly, patiently, at personal risk, feeding evidence into the legal case for months. And Jasmine, who could not give back the 2 years of silence, but could give everything she had now. Systems of control depend on isolation. The moment the isolation breaks, the system's power begins to drain. I looked at my hands on the conference table. Strong hands, hands that had made 1,000 meals and held crying children and signed papers without reading them and kept a house running for 33 years without being asked once if the woman doing the running was tired. Zora Mitchell came the following afternoon. She sat across from me in the back room of the bakery. The brick walls, the tall windows, the smell of brown sugar and vanilla in the air, even on a Tuesday afternoon in November. And she asked me a question I was not ready for. "Monique," she said, direct and unhurried in the way she always was, "I want you to answer me honestly. Are you building this foundation to prove Andre Bennett wrong? Or are you building it because Monique Bennett believes it needs to exist?" I opened my mouth. I closed it. Because the honest answer, the answer I had not examined fully until that moment, the answer I would not have admitted to another living person, was that somewhere inside me, woven into the genuine purpose and the real conviction and the deep love I had for what I was trying to build, there was a small, persistent, humiliated voice that wanted Andre to see. Wanted him to drive down Auburn Avenue and see the line out the door and feel, specifically and precisely, what I had felt at that kitchen table in September. I had not built the foundation for him, but I had not stopped picturing his face when I thought about succeeding. Zora nodded the way people nod when they hear the answer in what you don't say. "I know," she said. "I was there too, after my divorce. Building something to win an argument with someone who will never admit they lost is a different kind of project than building something because the world is missing it." She held my eyes. "Figure out which one you are doing, then come back to me." She left. I sat alone in the back room. Zora's question cut to the center of something that rarely gets examined in stories like this: the complicated, entirely human way that genuine purpose and wounded pride can coexist inside the same project. There is nothing shameful about wanting the person who hurt you to see your success. That desire is not weakness. It is not pettiness. It is a completely understandable response to years of being told you are worth nothing. Proving them wrong is a legitimate stage of recovery. But Zora, who had walked this path herself, understood something that Monique had not yet fully arrived at. That building something primarily as an act of revenge keeps you psychologically tethered to the person you are trying to escape. Every milestone becomes a message directed at them. Every setback is measured against their reaction. The foundation of your new life is still resting, secretly, on their opinion of you. Real freedom, the kind that Zora had found and was trying to offer Monique, requires something harder than proving someone wrong. It requires genuinely stopping caring whether they know they were wrong. It requires building for the people who need what you have to offer, not for the audience of one who was never going to applaud anyway. This distinction between building to prove someone wrong and building because it needs to exist is one of the quietest and most important psychological crossroads in any survivor's journey. And it is the one that Monique was about to find in the most unexpected place. After a while, I reached up to the second shelf of the storage closet and took down my mother's recipe tin. It was an old red tin with faded white flowers painted around the sides, dented slightly on one corner from the time it had fallen during a Thanksgiving prep session in the late 1990s. I kept it here now, next to the good vanilla and the canisters of brown sugar, because it had been in my kitchen my whole adult life, and I did not know how to have a kitchen without it. I had not opened it in months. Inside, under the index cards, peach cobbler, sweet potato pie, tea cake, layer cake with cream cheese frosting, there was an envelope. My mother's handwriting, her careful, schoolteacher cursive, each letter formed with intention. The envelope was not sealed. On the front, in that hand I would know anywhere, it said simply, "For Monique, when you're ready." She had written it 15 years ago. She had been alive then, still well enough to be at Sunday dinners, still sharp enough to watch and see and understand. She had written it while she was watching my marriage, while she was sitting at my kitchen table eating Sunday dinner and watching her son-in-law in his pressed vest accept compliments, and watching her daughter refill dishes and redirect conversations and manage every corner of the room and smile through all of it and call it a good life. She had watched all of that and gone home and written a letter and put it in the recipe tin and thought, she'll find it when she needs it. My mother wrote, "Baby, I never wanted to sell the Cascade Road house." I told him that, more than once. He has a way of explaining why things that are good for him are actually good for you, and I listened to him too long before I stopped. I signed something I shouldn't have, and I have regretted it every year since. I don't know what he's done with it. I only know I meant for you to have that house, the way you give a child a coat before the cold comes. Not because they've asked for it, but because you can see what's coming. He tells people you are fragile. He told the Hendersons. He told the family at church. He has been telling people a version of you for years, and none of them have any reason to question it, because they have never watched you do what I have watched you do. I have watched you hold this family together with your own two hands, and a faith that the people around you would eventually be worthy of what you gave them. You are not fragile, Monique. You are exhausted. Those are not the same thing. If you cannot leave for yourself, then leave for me. I did not live the way I lived to have you end up where I ended up. I spent too many years being the woman at the stove. I want more for you than I was ever brave enough to want for myself. There is a way out. I hid it the best I could. I pray it is still there when you find this. All my love, more than you have ever known, Mama. I sat on the floor of the storage room of Second Rise Bakery on Auburn Avenue in Atlanta, Georgia, and I held my mother's letter and I cried, the way daughters cry when they hear their mothers for the first time after they are gone. Not controlled, not managed, not with the water running so nobody can hear. I cried for her and for myself and for the 33 years and for the house she tried to give me and the door she tried to build and the man who had found every one of her attempts and quietly, methodically dismantled them. She had seen it, she had known, and she had tried to protect me in the only way available to her. I stayed on that floor for a while, Then I got up. I washed my face at the kitchen sink. I looked at myself in the small mirror above the utility shelf. I thought, I am not building this for Andre Bennett to see. I am building it for my mother. I am building it for the door she tried to leave me, and for every woman who needs a door and does not yet know that one exists. I called Simone. I'm ready, I said. Let's finish it. The hearing was held on a Monday morning in a downtown Atlanta courthouse on Pryor Street, Southwest. The judge was a woman of quiet authority who had the particular composure of someone who has presided over every possible arrangement of human dishonesty and remains unimpressed by all of it. Andre arrived with 2 attorneys and a full documentation package: the Sweet Auburn market video, the psychological assessments, the insurance records, Isaiah's signature, written statements from neighbors and church acquaintances describing my emotional fragility and financial dependence. He had been building this collection for years, and he had brought every piece of it, arranged in clean, labeled folders, to this Monday morning. He sat very straight, suit-pressed, the posture of 64 years of certainty about who he was in every room he entered. Simone stood up. She presented the complete financial forensics, every transfer, every account, every date, the forged signature on my mother's deed, accompanied by the report of a certified handwriting examiner, the insurance policy and its timeline relative to the preparation of the guardianship petition, the fabricated psychological assessments from a provider whose office had no record of my name, the strategy email folder from the backup drive, the recording from the gala, and Tiana's documentation, months of careful, anonymous work by a woman who understood wire transfers and institutional paper trails, delivered in manila envelopes with no return address, and a handwriting that Simone had recognized on the 3rd envelope. The financial evidence was sufficient to trigger a mandatory notification to the Georgia Insurance Commissioner. Andre's position as a director at his insurance company placed him under fiduciary obligations that the documented transactions had violated. An internal investigation was initiated within the month. Andre did not lose only the hearing. He lost the professional standing that had made his version of events credible. He lost the institutional authority that had made people believe him over me for 33 years. He lost the system he had built, not just around me, but around himself. The whole structure came down. The settlement returned a portion of my mother's estate, enough, structured carefully under Simone's direction, to establish Second Rise Foundation on fully independent legal footing, with a governance structure that gave me complete authority and gave Andre Bennett no claim, no access, and no mechanism for interference of any kind. I stood in that courtroom on Pryor Street when it was done, and I held my mother's letter in my coat pocket, and I looked across the room at Andre Bennett. He looked at me for a long time. And then he said something I had not expected. Not in the performing voice, not in the management voice, not in any voice I had heard from him in 33 years. In something stripped of all of it. I always knew you were stronger than me. That was the whole problem. If you knew it too, I had nothing to hold on to. And here is where we must pause. Because what Andre said in that courtroom, however late, however insufficient, is one of the most psychologically revealing moments in this entire story. Controllers, as therapists who specialize in coercive relationships will tell you, do not control out of strength. They control out of a specific, profound, often unconscious fear. The fear of being abandoned by someone they believe is fundamentally better than they are. The need to diminish the other person is not cruelty for its own sake. It is a desperate, misguided attempt to make the relationship feel safe. Safe in the only way that person knows how to create safety, which is to make sure the other person cannot leave. Andre Bennett spent 33 years making Monique smaller because some part of him had always understood that the real Monique, the woman who could run a household, raise a son, build community, make something from nothing with her own hands, was more capable than he was willing to let either of them acknowledge. To acknowledge her strength would have meant acknowledging his own fear. And fear for a man who had built his entire identity around control and competence, was the one thing he could not afford to feel. This does not excuse what he did, not the forged signature, not the stolen inheritance, not the fabricated psychological assessments, not 33 years of systematic erosion of another human being's sense of self. None of that becomes acceptable because we understand its origin. But understanding it matters. It matters because it tells us something true about how these systems work and how to recognize them. Control dressed as love, fear dressed as power, insecurity dressed as authority. And it matters because of what Monique did with that confession. She did not soften. She did not offer consolation. She did not reach for his hand or give him the absolution he may have been hoping for. She looked at the man who had spent 33 years building a prison around her, and she told him the truth. Clearly, completely, without cruelty, and without gentleness. I thought about 33 years. About a kitchen table, and a refrigerator humming, and a red earring in a vest pocket, and a tin with faded white flowers, and my mother's pencil script on an index card. I thought about a little boy doing homework at the walnut table. I thought about a young woman in a green dress, folding a piece of paper and setting it on a podium. I said, "You didn't control me because I was weak. You controlled me because you were afraid of the day I would remember who I was. You spent 33 years making me into a woman who was afraid to walk out her own front door. My mother spent her whole life trying to leave me a door to walk through. Today, I am opening that door for other women. And this time, there is no one standing behind me to close it." Andre pressed his lips together. He looked at the floor. And when he looked back up, there were tears on his face. Real ones, I believe, not performed, not strategic. The tears of a man who has finally run out of architecture and is standing in what remains. Those tears were not my responsibility. I turned. I walked out of the courtroom on Pryor Street Southwest in downtown Atlanta without looking back. Not because I was fleeing, not because I was afraid of what I'd see, because the story he had written for me was finished, and I had somewhere else to be. What happened in the 2 years that followed was more than I had let myself imagine. It was the life my mother always believed I was capable of living. In the weeks after the hearing, Andre Bennett ceased to appear at the events and gatherings and Sunday morning handshakes that had constituted his public life in Atlanta for 30 years. The city is large, but certain communities within it are intimate. And in those communities, truth that finally has paperwork and a recording and the public testimony of a son at a microphone does not stay quiet for long. The investigation at his company moved with the deliberate pace of institutional processes, but it moved. The people who had called him a good man for decades found that their recollections required quiet revision. The professional credibility that had made him believable over me for 33 years was, as it turned out, resting on a foundation that had the same structural integrity as everything else he had built. I did not celebrate. I did not arrange a party, or call people to share the news, or sit on Jasmine's porch talking about it until midnight. My mother raised me to believe that how you conduct yourself in victory matters as much as whether you win at all. I think about her teaching in that regard fairly often. When people ask me how I felt about the outcome of the hearing, I said, like my life is finally mine. If they press for more, for righteous anger, for satisfaction, for some declarative statement of triumph, I would offer them a slice of sweet potato pie and let the conversation find its own way elsewhere. The truth was simpler and more whole than anything I could have performed. I woke up every morning in a small apartment on Ponce de Leon Avenue. 2 rooms, a good coffee maker, a window looking out at the street, and I felt something I had not felt in so long that I had genuinely forgotten it had a name. Safe. Not the performed safety of a woman who has mastered the management of a dangerous environment. Real safety. Morning light through the window safety. The kind where you pour your coffee without listening for footsteps on the stairs. There's a particular kind of peace that survivors of long-term coercive relationships describe. One that is almost impossible to explain to people who have not experienced its opposite. It is not joy exactly, though it can feel like joy. It is the absence of a specific low-grade terror that has been present for so long that the person has stopped being able to perceive it as terror. They have simply adapted to it, the way the body adapts to a chronic pain it cannot resolve, until the absence of that pain feels startling, strange, unfamiliar. Monique's 2 rooms on Ponce de Leon Avenue were not a triumph of material success. They were the opposite of the Buckhead house in every measurable way. Smaller, quieter, without the furniture and the walnut table and the embroidered placemats and 33 years of accumulated domestic architecture. And they were, without qualification, the most valuable space she had ever lived in. Because in those 2 rooms, she was the only authority. Her name was on the lease. Her hands chose what went in the refrigerator. Her voice was the only one that decided when the lights went off at night. And no one, not a husband, not a system, not a carefully constructed legal portfolio, had any mechanism for taking that from her. That is what freedom actually feels like when you have spent decades without it. Not like flight, like stillness. Like a Tuesday morning with coffee, looking out at the street, with nowhere to be afraid of. Second Rise Bakery kept growing. Women came in for sweet potato pie and stayed for 2 hours. They ordered more coffee than they drank, and they sat at the mismatched tables that Jasmine had helped me pick out, and they told me things that they had not told anyone. About accounts that only carried their husband's name, about documents they had signed without reading because asking questions cost more than they had energy to spend, about years of being told, quietly, persistently, by someone very close to them, that they were bad with money, too emotional, too fragile, too dependent. Told it so many times that they had eventually stopped noticing when they began to agree. I listened. I had a great deal of practice with the specific kind of listening that requires you to stay present with another person's pain without retreating into your own. Tiana came to me on a Sunday evening about 6 weeks after the hearing. The bakery was closed. I was restocking and playing old gospel music on the portable speaker. She knocked on the glass front door and I let her in. She stood in the middle of the room in plain clothes, without the composed, professional surface I usually saw, and she said, "I want to help with the foundation. I know banking. I know how financial documentation works, and exactly how it gets manipulated to trap people who trust the wrong person. I want to use what I know." She paused. "I understand I stayed quiet too long. I am not asking you to forget that. I'm asking you to let me do something with what I should have done sooner." I looked at her. This young woman who had sat at my kitchen table for years, who had looked away, and who had eventually, quietly, when the weight of knowing became heavier than the comfort of not acting, begun mailing evidence to a lawyer in manila envelopes. "If you are going to do this," I said, "you need to understand something first. Silence is not only a personal failing. Silence can be a structure. It can hold things in place the same way walls do, the same way documents do. If you truly understand that, not just as an apology, but as something you have thought all the way through, then yes, I want you here." She did not cry or thank me at length. She simply nodded, the way a person nods when they have heard something that is true and have decided to let it change them. Isaiah came by the bakery more and more as the months passed. He always called ahead, which was new. He never overstayed, which was also new. A deliberate consideration that only comes from paying close attention to a person you have hurt and making the choice, every time, to do better. One evening in late spring, we were stacking chairs after closing, the street quiet outside the tall windows, the last of the day's light coming in low and gold, and Isaiah held a chair in both hands and stopped and said, "Mom, for over a year I told myself that staying quiet was keeping the peace, that I was protecting the family by not forcing a crisis. I know now that when one person is being hurt and you stand in the middle and call it neutrality, you're not in the middle at all. You're standing next to the person who has the power. That's the side I was on, and I have to own that. I looked at my son, this tall, tired, earnest man made partly from me and partly from a man who had spent 3 decades modeling exactly the wrong lesson about what it means to love your family. I don't need you to hate your father, I said. I need you to never again look at the truth and call it someone else's business. He nodded. I love you, I said. I love you too, Mom. We stacked the rest of the chairs in the comfortable silence of two people who are rebuilding something together without a blueprint. And the old gospel music played on, and the evening light held the room in the particular amber way it always did. And it was enough. Jasmine came one afternoon in November, when the rain was falling straight and hard outside and the bakery was almost empty, just the two of us and the sound of water on the window glass. She sat at the counter with both hands around her coffee cup and did not say anything for a while. Then she said, I saw them together 2 years before I told you. 2 years, Monique. I kept saying it wasn't my place. I kept saying you had to make your own choices. I kept saying you seemed okay. She looked down at her cup. I was telling myself a story so I could stay comfortable. I poured myself a cup and sat across from her. Some secrets don't destroy families, I said. The people who see the truth and decide it belongs to someone else, they are the ones who keep the structure standing from the outside. I am not saying it to punish you. I am saying it because you need to understand it if you are going to be part of what I am building. Jasmine wiped her eyes. I understand it, she said. Good, I said. Now drink your coffee. You drove here in this rain. It would be a shame to let it go cold. Zora Mitchell finalized the investment for the second foundation location at a meeting in her office on Peachtree Center Avenue. Before I signed, she looked at me across the conference table and said, I have one condition. Name it, I said. You keep full creative and operational control. Your name, your vision, your decisions. The moment this becomes something you need to request permission for, she paused, it is no longer what I'm putting money into. I signed. In my office at the back of the bakery, I hung 2 photographs side by side on the brick wall. The first was my wedding photograph taken at Ebenezer Baptist Church in the spring of 1991. I am 29 years old in that photograph, and I am smiling with the open, unguarded joy of a woman who believes completely in the life she is walking toward. I look at that photograph sometimes, and I do not feel anger. I feel something closer to tenderness for that young woman. She was not foolish. She loved someone who eventually chose fear over love. That is his failing, not hers. It will never be hers. The second photograph was taken on the morning the first cohort of Second Rise Foundation's Financial Independence Program completed their final session. 12 women standing together in front of the bakery on Auburn Avenue, squinting slightly into the October sun, several of them laughing at something one of them said just as the picture was taken. Under my mother's letter, mounted on the wall between the 2 photographs, I wrote on a piece of cardstock in my own hand. Mama left me a door. It took me 33 years to find it, but I promise I will never lock it behind me. That evening, when I turned off the bakery lights and locked the front door and stepped out onto Auburn Avenue in the October dark, I stood on the sidewalk for a moment and let the night be around me. The street was quiet. A car passed slowly. Down the block, someone had a window open and music floating out of it, something old and warm. I whispered to myself, to my mother, to whoever was out there listening, I'm not running from anything anymore. I am building something I couldn't even have dared to dream before. And I walked home. 2 years after that evening, standing in the back office, looking at 43 names on a wall, I finally understood the full meaning of what my mother had been trying to give me all along. 2 years after the hearing on Pryor Street, SW, I stood in the small office behind Second Rise Bakery on a Tuesday morning in October and looked at the wall. It was not a remarkable wall, warm cream paint, a wooden board mounted at eye level, and on the board, 43 names. Some in careful cursive, some in printed block letters, some with small personal additions alongside, a drawn flower, a tiny star, a little heart in pencil that someone had added and then apparently decided to leave. Each name belonged to a woman who had walked through the front door of this bakery carrying something she had not yet found the words to say out loud. Each name belonged to a woman who had walked back out with tools and documentation and legal referrals and the particular knowledge, the kind that settles differently from information, the kind that actually changes how you breathe. That what had happened to her had a name and a pattern and a way through. 43 women in 2 years. I am 63 years old now. I wear my hair the same, short, softly curled, the way my mother wore hers. I still make the peach cobbler from the recipe card with the coffee ring on it. I still worship at Ebenezer Baptist, third pew from the front, though now I sit beside Jasmine instead of in the careful, managed distance that had characterized my marriage's public performance for 3 decades. I still talk too long with Zora about everything other than business when we are officially in a business meeting. I still call Isaiah on Sunday evenings, and we talk in that slightly careful, genuinely loving way of people who are rebuilding something together without a blueprint and are committed to getting it right regardless of how long it takes. But I am not who I was. The change is not dramatic. It is not loud. It will not make the kind of story that people tell at parties to demonstrate how resilient they are. What I am now is something quieter and more whole than I have clean language for. A woman who woke up one morning and understood that the silence in her apartment was not the silence of loneliness, not the silence of abandonment, not the silence of a life diminished down to nothing. It was the silence of a morning that belonged entirely to itself. I made coffee. I stood at the kitchen window and watched the street fill up with a Tuesday. A dog walker with 3 small dogs, a woman in scrubs heading to the bus stop, 2 little boys on bikes, one of them standing on the pedals going downhill faster than was strictly advisable. The ordinary, irreplaceable beauty of the world continuing without requiring my performance of any kind. I thought, this is what she meant. This is what she was trying to give me all along. Not the apartment, not the bakery, not the legal settlement or the foundation or the 43 names on the wall. She was trying to give me a Tuesday morning where I was not afraid, where I poured my coffee and watched the street and felt nothing but the morning and the warmth of the cup in my hands. That was the inheritance. That was the door she built. There is a tendency when we tell stories of women who have survived and rebuilt to measure the outcome in the language that the society that hurt them already uses. Money, property, public recognition, visible success. We want the financial settlement. We want the thriving business. We want the viral moment and the standing ovation and the proof that she won, measured in the same currency of status and material power that was used to control her. And those things matter. They are real and they are meaningful and they represent genuine justice. But the deepest healing that takes place in survivors of long-term emotional abuse is rarely visible from the outside. It happens quietly, in private, in the particular moment when a person stops performing safety and begins to actually feel it. When they stop monitoring for threats that are no longer there. When they reach for their coffee in the morning and their hand does not hesitate. Monique Bennett became financially secure. She built something real and lasting and good. Her son grew into accountability. Her daughter-in-law turned guilt into purpose. Her friend arrived, late, but arrived. But the truest measure of everything that changed is not the second location, or the 43 names, or the investment from Zora Mitchell. It is a Tuesday morning in October, a window, a cup of coffee, and a woman who is not afraid. That is what was stolen from her for 33 years, and that is what she got back. The real wealth in my life is not the second foundation location, or the investment, or the calls I receive from women in other cities asking how to replicate the model. The real wealth is my son sitting across from me at the bakery counter, eating sweet potato pie and asking me, with no agenda at all, how my week was. The real wealth is Tiana arriving early on Thursdays to go through the Foundation's financial reports with a thoroughness and care that I know costs her something because she is paying attention in a way she wishes she had started sooner. And that cost is the price of her becoming the person she is choosing to be. I see it in her. It looks like dignity being built one Thursday at a time. The real wealth is a woman named Denise who came into Second Rise Bakery 3 weeks ago on a quiet Wednesday afternoon. 57 years old, recently separated. She was wearing the particular expression I had come to recognize, the expression of a person who has not yet fully understood that the exhaustion they are feeling is not a character flaw, not a personal failing, not evidence of everything their husband always said about them. Just a reasonable response to years of being systematically diminished. She sat down at the counter and ordered a slice of lemon cake. Then she looked up at me and said, very quietly, as though she were not entirely sure she was allowed to say it out loud, "My husband told me I would never survive without him." I set down what I was doing. I sat across from her. I did not rush. The morning light was doing its gold and merciful thing through the tall windows, the way it always does at that hour. "What do you think?" I asked her. "Do you believe him?" She looked at her hands, she looked at the cake, she looked back up at me. "I don't know yet," she said. "I think that's why I came in here." "That," I said, "is exactly the right reason." I got her another cup of coffee. I sat with her for an hour. When she left, she had a card for Simone Powell's office, and the name of our program coordinator, and a piece of peach cobbler wrapped in wax paper for the road. She stood at the door for a moment before she opened it, and she looked back at me with an expression I have no precise word for, something between relief and the very first breath of something larger. I watched her walk out onto Auburn Avenue into the October morning, and I thought of my mother, writing by hand in her kitchen 15 years ago, folding the letter, placing it beneath the recipe cards, closing the tin. She'll find it when she's ready. I went back to the office. I sat for a while with the letter in my hands. I have read it so many times that I could speak every sentence from memory, but I still read it with my eyes because I need the physical reality of her pen on the paper. I need to feel that she held this same paper. I need that thread. I placed one hand over the letter and I said quietly to my mother, to the office, to the 43 names on the wall, "I left, Mama. I found the door, and I am not locking it behind me." And now I want to speak to you directly for just a moment, not as Monique, not as a story, as one woman simply to another. If you are sitting somewhere right now in a house that used to feel like home, but has come to feel like a place where your voice disappears before it reaches the walls, I want you to hear this. You are not too old. You are not too late. You have not used up your portion of new beginnings. What looks like weakness in you, the part that keeps accommodating, keeps reducing, keeps finding new ways to make yourself smaller so that someone else can feel larger, that is not weakness. That is a woman who has been told quietly and persistently and for a very long time by someone very close to her that her perception of herself was not to be trusted, that she was fragile, that she was dependent, that without him, she was nothing much at all. And she heard it so many times from someone who should have been the one person on earth who told her the opposite, that eventually, quietly, without even noticing the moment it happened, she began to believe it. It was not true then. It is not true now. What you lived through is real. The years you gave are real. The labor nobody counted is real. The things you signed without reading because asking questions cost more than you had to spend. That is real too, and it has a name. And there are people who understand it, and there is help. You are not the woman that the person who diminished you needed you to believe you were. You are the woman who kept going. Through every cold silence and every rearranged truth and every Tuesday that looked exactly like the Tuesday before it, you kept going. That matters more than you have been permitted to understand. The path forward does not always begin with a courtroom. It does not always begin with a recording or a lawyer or a public moment of vindication. Sometimes it begins with a Tuesday morning, with a cup of coffee and a window and the quiet decision to sit with your own truth long enough to let it speak. Sometimes it begins with finding an old letter in a recipe tin. Sometimes, and I believe this with everything in me, it begins right now, in this moment. with a voice inside you that has been trying to say something important for a very long time, and you, finally, listening. This story reminds us that real wealth is not a number in an account or a deed with your name on it or even a victory in a courthouse on a Monday morning. Real wealth is a Tuesday where you are not afraid. It is a son who learned, late, imperfectly, genuinely, to tell the truth. It is a daughter-in-law who turned guilt into action. It is a friend who finally said the hard thing and a mentor who asked the right question at exactly the right moment. It is 43 names on a wall and the 44th woman walking through the door. This story reminds us that love, true love, the kind that deserves the name, does not ask you to disappear. It does not require your silence as the price of your safety. Control is not love. It is fear wearing the costume of power. And this story reminds us, most of all, that it is never too late to find the door your mother tried to leave you, to open it wide, and to hold it open for the woman walking behind you. Quiet strength does not announce itself when it rises, but when it finally, patiently, completely rises, even the people who spent years trying to make it small can feel the difference. Second Rise Foundation. For every woman who is still finding the door.